I used to believe that marriage was supposed to be about trust, about choosing a partner who would stand beside you through all the unpredictable storms of life. At 47 years old, after 23 years of marriage, I thought I knew who my husband was. His name was Vincent, and in all the little corners of my memory, I had cataloged the story of us the way we met at community college, the way we dreamed of owning a house together, and the way we promised to grow old as companions, not just as spouses. But as time wore on, I started to notice how those promises became more like distant echoes than truths. And nothing could have prepared me for the betrayal I uncovered, the betrayal that broke me, reshaped me, and ultimately forced me to rise again from the ashes of humiliation, with a revenge so calculated it felt like justice. It started with the lies. Small ones, the kind that slip easily off the tongue and could almost pass as believable if I hadn't been watching him for so long. Vincent was 52, a fitness trainer who had always been proud of his physique. He liked to boast that even with gray at his temples, women still turned their heads at the gym. I had grown accustomed to that. I had been proud of it once, too proud to be married to a man who seemed so confident, so alive. But somewhere in the last few years, pride turned to unease, and unease turned into dread. The first sign was his humming. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? To say that humming could betray a man. But I knew him. Vincent never hummed unless he was truly happy, unless there was something fueling him beyond the mundane. And suddenly, there he was coming home late from the gym, with that tune under his breath like a secret melody meant for someone else. He'd say he was training clients that summer was around the corner, and everyone wanted to look good, but his excuses felt thinner than tissue paper. After working in human resources for 15 years, I had trained myself to read people, to hear the tremors in their voices, when they lied, to see the twitch in their eyes, when they avoided the truth. Vincent was no longer the man I trusted. He had become a stranger performing poorly rehearsed lines. And then came the perfume. Sweet. Not mine. Not any brand I wore. It clung to his workout clothes like a whisper left behind. When I asked him about it, he blamed cleaning supplies at the gym. The way he dismissed me as though I were foolish made my chest tighten in rage and sorrow. Because once upon a time, he would have never looked me in the eyes and lied like that. Once upon a time, he would have cared enough to at least try. One evening, I decided enough was enough. While Vincent was showering, I slipped outside to his truck. The phoenix sun still radiated off the metal, even though it was dusk, and when I opened the driver's side door, the heat hit me like a wall. But beneath the heat was a scent, his cologne mixed with something undeniably feminine. My fingers searched through the glove compartment under the seats until I felt something small and slick wedged deep in the shadows. I pulled it out. My heart nearly stopped. A tube. Personal lubricant. The expensive kind. The kind we hadn't touched in years. My hands shook as I stared at it, and in that moment, the years of doubt hardened into reality. I didn't need a confession. I didn't need to ask questions. I already knew. I sat in my car for a long time that night, staring at the tube. 23 years of marriage reduced to this, to sneaking around and secrets buried under car seats. My mind replayed every memory we had made, all the sacrifices, the fights, the reconciliations, and the promises of forever. Was this what forever looked like? My heart throbbed with the weight of it, with the knowledge that somewhere along the way I had been replaced. Not just as his wife, but as his confidant, as the woman who once mattered most. The following days, I became someone else, a detective, an observer in my own home. He thought I was naive, but I was documenting, piecing together every puzzle piece he left scattered. Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, always late nights, always special sessions with a young client named Kylie. I found her on social media, blonde, 23, a body sculpted by both genetics and surgeons. And there, in her workout videos, was Vincent. His voice, his laugh, his hands on her shoulders, guiding her through movements too intimate to be professional. "That's perfect, baby," he said in one clip. Baby. The word that once belonged to me now soiled on his lips as he whispered it to someone else. That night, I sat in my office pretending to review files, but all I could see was his betrayal, flashing like a neon sign across my mind. I could have filed for divorce then. I could have confronted him, screamed, demanded the truth. But rage has a strange way of giving birth to clarity. If he thought he was clever, if he thought he could humiliate me in silence, then he was going to learn just how dangerous silence could be when it was mine. The plan came to me like it had always been waiting in the shadows. If Vincent wanted to play games with lubricants, then I would play too, but I would rewrite the rules. That Saturday, while he showered, I drove to Home Depot. The aisles smelled of dust and chemicals, but I knew exactly what I was looking for. Gorilla Glue, professional grade, industrial strength, the kind of adhesive that didn't forgive mistakes. My hand trembled slightly as I paid for it, but my smile never wavered. This was not weakness anymore. This was resolve. At a medical supply store, I bought a syringe large enough to belong in a veterinary kit. The clerk asked if I owned horses, and I smiled politely, telling her it was for a friend's ranch animals. Lies, but ones that slipped out so easily they startled even me. Back home, I worked with a precision born from years of handling workplace investigations, safety reports, and delicate employee disputes. I drained the lubricant tube dry, and with careful control, I filled it with Gorilla Glue. The texture was nearly identical, the tube resealed perfectly. No one would know until it was far too late. When Vincent left the house later looking polished and giddy in his expensive gym clothes, he kissed me with that same detached familiarity he had given me for months. "Love you, babe," he said, heading out the door. And all I could think was how hollow those words had become. I watched his truck disappear down the street, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel powerless. I felt ready. To seal my alibi, I picked up his mother, Doris, for brunch. Doris was 74, sharp-eyed, and far more perceptive than her son ever realized. Over eggs and mimosas, she looked at me with the kind of knowing that made my skin prickle. "Marriage has its ups and downs," I said when she asked. But she only sighed, murmuring that Vincent was too much like his father, charming, reckless, and prone to midlife mistakes. She didn't say affair. She didn't need to. Her silence told me she already knew the kind of man he had become. And sitting across from her, I felt both guilt and vindication. She deserved better from her son. I deserved better from my husband. And soon we would all have the truth laid bare. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed with a neighborhood app notification. Emergency vehicles 3 doors down. I kept my face calm as I sipped my drink, but inside adrenaline coursed through me. Fire trucks, paramedics, my neighbors whispering about 2 people stuck together during intimate activities, covered in bed sheets, carried out like a grotesque parade. My neighbors didn't know names, but I did. And as I excused myself politely, drove home and walked into my kitchen, I allowed myself for just a breath to feel satisfaction deeper than words. He had thought I was the fool, but the truth was, I had been the judge all along. The news spread faster than wildfire, though no one mentioned names at first. Whispers floated through the neighborhood like smoke seeping under locked doors. People described the ambulance ride, the way paramedics had to cut through bed sheets, the embarrassed screams, the visible panic. Everyone pretended they didn't know, but they knew. They always knew. And within 24 hours, the story had a name. Vincent's name. By the time he returned home from the hospital, I was waiting. He shuffled inside, red-faced, his steps uneven, his pride shattered. I had rehearsed what I might say, but when I saw him so small, so utterly dismantled, I said nothing. Silence was my weapon, sharper than any blade. He tried to speak, tried to turn the story into a joke, but his voice trembled, and the laughter rang hollow. "Crazy night, huh?" he muttered. I just looked at him, unblinking, until his smirk dissolved into ash. The next day his mother called me. Doris's voice was tight, brittle, like glass about to crack. I heard she whispered. I can't even repeat the words, but I heard. I sat there with the phone pressed against my ear, my throat heavy, my chest aching with 1,000 unspoken truths. For a moment, guilt threatened to swallow me whole. She didn't deserve to bear this shame. But when she asked if it was true, if her son had been caught in the arms of another woman, I answered with a steadiness I didn't know I had. yes. There was silence on the other end, then a sigh so deep it seemed to carry decades of disappointment. Just like his father, she said finally. I hoped he would be different. Her words landed heavy, and I realized then that his betrayal wasn't new to her. She had seen this cycle before, endured it, and prayed her son wouldn't repeat it. But here we were. At the gym, the whispers turned into open ridicule. Clients dropped their memberships. Young men joked about him in locker rooms. Women shared knowing glances, smirks that carved him into pieces. Kylie, the blonde, 23-year-old, he had risked everything for, vanished. Blocked his number, deleted her videos, pretended she never knew him. He had destroyed his marriage, his reputation, and for what? For a fling that abandoned him the moment humiliation arrived. I should have felt victorious, and part of me did, but victory has an aftertaste bitter and metallic. At night, lying in bed alone, I replayed the scene in my head, not of him being humiliated, but of me discovering the tube, filling it with glue, orchestrating the downfall. And sometimes I wondered if I had gone too far, if my vengeance had crossed into cruelty. But then I remembered the humming, the perfume, the lies so casual they were like second nature, the way he dismissed me, treated me like a fool, the way he stole years from me, years I could have spent building a life with someone who respected me. And my doubt melted back into resolve. No, I had not gone too far. He had. I had simply handed him the mirror he refused to face. The community turned cold toward him. Invitations stopped coming. Old friends stopped calling. Even his siblings, who once bragged about having a brother who was the fittest guy in his 50s, stopped mentioning his name. Vincent tried to hide from the shame, but humiliation has a way of clinging like glue itself, sticking to every surface, no matter how hard you scrub. He became angry, at me, at the world, at himself. He accused me of setting him up, though he couldn't prove it. He demanded loyalty, forgiveness, begged for second chances, then exploded when I gave him nothing but silence. "You're my wife," he shouted one night, his voice shaking the walls. And for the first time in 23 years, I shouted back. Was I your wife when you were with her? Was I your wife when you lied to my face? Was I your wife when you carried another woman's perfume into our home? My voice cracked, but it didn't break. Don't you dare call me your wife now when it only suits you. He stormed out that night, slamming the door so hard the picture frames rattled. But I didn't chase him. I didn't cry. I sat at the dining room table with my hands folded, my heart steady. Because deep down I knew this was no longer about saving a marriage. This was about saving myself. Weeks passed and the divorce papers came. Vincent didn't fight them, he couldn't. His shame was too public, his power too broken. I signed my name with a hand that barely trembled, 23 years reduced to ink on paper. But when I slid the pen across the final line, I felt something unexpected. Relief. It was over. But endings have a way of dragging their feet. Even after the divorce, he tried to linger. Tried to send me messages, long apologies filled with self-pity. Tried to call late at night, drunk, slurring words about regret. I ignored them all. Because forgiveness wasn't mine to give anymore. He had to live with what he had done, and I had to live with what I had survived. And survival, I realized, is its own kind of revenge. I began to rebuild not just my life, but myself. I went back to school, taking night classes and counseling. I poured my savings into a small practice, one dedicated to helping women who had been betrayed, belittled, broken by those they trusted most. My first clients were hesitant, their stories whispered through tears. But as I listened, as I offered them the understanding I had once craved, I realized that my pain had found a purpose. Every woman who sat across from me carried a wound. And with every story I heard, I stitched together my own healing. My vengeance had ended Vincent's facade, but my true victory was in building something lasting, something rooted in compassion instead of cruelty. Still, sometimes late at night when the house was quiet, I thought about that day, about the glue, about the ambulance, about the neighbors whispering, and I would ask myself if I could have chosen another way. But then I'd remember how small he had made me feel, how invisible, how disposable, and I knew that without that act, without that final irrevocable line in the sand, I might still be there waiting for a man who would never change. Now I was no longer waiting, I was living. In the weeks after the divorce, I felt like I was learning how to breathe again. For years, my lungs had carried the heaviness of betrayal, doubt, and humiliation. Now, when I woke up in the quiet of my own bedroom, sunlight pooling across the sheets, I felt something unfamiliar peace. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was subtle, fragile, like a bird settling on a branch. But it was mine. I started to rediscover myself. I signed up for painting classes, something I had given up when Vincent said it was a waste of time. I joined a book club where I found laughter spilling out of me more freely than it had in decades. And I returned to my counseling courses with a new energy, determined to use my story not just as a scar, but as a lantern for others lost in the dark. The women I counseled came to me with eyes full of exhaustion and voices full of doubt. They asked me if they were crazy, if they were overreacting, if they were to blame for the betrayals they endured. I recognized myself in them, the same questions I had once asked at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was somehow the problem. And with every woman who sat across from me, I told the truth I had fought to claim: you are not crazy. You are not too much. You are not to blame for someone else's betrayal. Each time I spoke those words, I felt them heal a part of me too. Because healing isn't linear, it's circular. It moves in waves back and forth. Some nights I still cried. Some mornings I still felt the weight of loneliness pressing against me. But as I guided others, I found myself walking out of the wreckage step by step. Meanwhile, Vincent's life was collapsing in ways even I hadn't imagined. At first, he tried to salvage his career. He told anyone who would listen that the incident was exaggerated, that rumors blew it out of proportion. But whispers have a way of sticking, especially when they're laced with humiliation, so graphic no one forgets it. His client list shrank until it was almost empty. Parents no longer wanted their teenage daughters training with him. Married women avoided him altogether. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that he had been spotted drinking heavily at bars, nursing beers until his eyes glazed over. Some nights he would pick fights with strangers as though anger could cover shame. Other nights he would sit alone scrolling through his phone, desperate for someone to answer. Kylie, of course, had long since erased him from her life. She had her youth, her beauty, and endless admirers. He was nothing more than a middle-aged embarrassment, a story she likely told her friends with laughter. For a long time I thought about ignoring the updates. I told myself I didn't care. But the truth is, I listened. I absorbed every detail of his downfall. Not because I wanted to gloat, but because I needed to understand the full shape of the storm I had unleashed. Betrayal had wounded me, yes, but humiliation was his punishment. And yet punishment doesn't always bring peace. One evening, as I sat grading papers for my counseling class, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. When I opened it, my heart stuttered. "I'm sorry, I'm broken. I don't know how to keep going. Please, can we talk?" It was Vincent. For a moment, the old reflex stirred the part of me that once rushed to comfort him, to pick up his broken pieces, to glue them back together. But then I remembered the tube in his truck, the lies, the perfume, the way he had looked at me like a fool while giving his tenderness to someone else. My hand trembled, but I deleted the message. He had chosen his path. I had chosen mine. The next day, one of my clients, a woman my age, betrayed after 30 years of marriage, asked me, "How do you know when it's really over? How do you stop caring about him, even when he doesn't deserve it?" I paused, the weight of her question heavy in the air. And then I told her the truth I was still learning myself. You don't stop caring overnight. The memories don't vanish. But you stop sacrificing yourself on the altar of someone else's mistakes. You stop giving them the power to define your worth. That's when it's over. That's when you're free. Her tears fell and I held her hand. In helping her, I realized I had answered myself too. Still, there were nights when doubt crept back in. I wondered if my revenge had been too cruel, too permanent. The image of Vincent carried out of that house, stuck in humiliation, sometimes haunted me. And then I thought of myself, how I had been carried for years in chains of ridicule and deceit, invisible, voiceless, betrayed. My revenge hadn't created his downfall. His choices had. I had simply revealed them in a way no one could ignore. And in that revelation, I found my liberation. Months passed and my world began to bloom again. I hosted gatherings with women I met in my classes. I traveled to the coast, walked barefoot in the sand, and watched the sun melt into the ocean with a serenity I once thought impossible. Slowly, joy returned, not the naive joy of my 20s, but a deeper, steadier joy. The kind that comes when you've lost everything and discovered you are still standing. One spring afternoon, I planted a garden in my backyard. As I pressed my hands into the soil, I thought of how life works in cycles, how things must break down before they bloom again. Betrayal had broken me. Revenge had burned the remnants. But healing was the bloom, fragile and stubborn, pushing through the dirt to find the sun. I still carried scars. I always would. But scars are proof not of weakness but of survival. And every time I looked at mine, I reminded myself I was not the woman who stayed silent while her husband lied. I was not the woman who accepted humiliation as her fate. I was the woman who chose herself even when it meant standing alone. And in the end, standing alone was far better than lying beside someone who had betrayed me. Spring turned into summer, and with each passing week, I felt myself stepping more firmly into a life that was mine alone. The counseling practice I had started almost timidly began to grow. Women found me not through advertisements or glossy promises, but through whispers, through word of mouth. They came because they had heard my story, maybe not every sordid detail, but enough to know I understood, enough to know I could sit across from them and not look away from their pain. There was Maria, who had discovered her husband's affair with her best friend. There was Evelyn, whose spouse gambled away their savings. There was Hannah, barely 30, who had left a man that bruised both her body and her soul. They sat in my office with trembling hands and tear-streaked faces, and I listened. I didn't offer them easy cliches or hollow reassurances. I told them what I had learned the hard way, that pain carves us hollow, but hollowness is not the end. Hollowness is space, and space can be filled with new beginnings. Each session I found myself giving them words I had once needed to hear, words that I had searched for when I lay awake beside a man who no longer loved me. And as they healed piece by piece, I healed too. There was something powerful about transforming my own humiliation into a seed that grew into hope for others. But while my life was finding its rhythm, Vincent's was collapsing in jagged fragments. I heard through neighbors that he had been fired from the gym. Officially, they cited unprofessional behavior. Unofficially, it was the scandal no one could ignore. No one wanted to sweat in a room where whispers clung to every corner, where Snickers followed him like a shadow. Clients left in droves, and the owners cut him loose to save their reputation. After that, he tried to start his own training business out of a rented warehouse. But humiliation has a long memory. Only a handful of desperate young men signed up, and within months, the business folded. He lost money, he lost credibility, he lost himself. Occasionally, he tried to reach out again, emails, messages, even a letter once left on my porch in the dead of night. In it, he wrote that he had lost everything, that he still loved me, that he didn't know how to move on. I read it once carefully, then folded it back into the envelope and burned it in the fireplace. Because love is not proven in apologies written after the fact. Love is proven in the everyday choices that come long before betrayal, and his choices had already spoken. Meanwhile, my foundation began to grow beyond anything I imagined. I partnered with a nonprofit that provided legal aid to women seeking divorces. Together, we hosted workshops teaching women how to protect themselves financially, how to recognize the signs of manipulation before it consumed them. I stood on stages I never thought I'd stand on, telling my story, not with shame, but with power. And every time I spoke, I saw faces in the crowd light up with recognition, with relief that they weren't alone. But the more my light grew, the darker Vincent's world seemed to become. Neighbors whispered that he rarely left his apartment anymore, that he had gained weight, lost his sharpness, that bottles lined his trash bin like soldiers fallen in battle. He had become a ghost of the man he once was, once so proud, so polished, so certain of his charm. Now his name was a cautionary tale. His story a warning parents told their daughters. I won't pretend I didn't feel a chill of satisfaction when I heard those things. Part of me did, because for once the balance felt restored. For once, karma had not just brushed past me, it had stood firmly in front of me and delivered its verdict. And yet, late at night, when the world was quiet, I sometimes felt the echo of sorrow. Not for the man he had become, but for the years I had given him. For the younger version of myself who had believed so completely, who had loved so deeply, who had built her identity around someone unworthy. I mourned her innocence. I mourned her trust. But I also thanked her. Because without her, I would not be here. Without her endurance, I would not have survived to become the woman I am now. The turning point came one autumn evening when I received a call from Doris, his mother. Her voice was thin, weary. "Leah," she said, "he's not doing well." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. She wasn't asking me to fix him. She wasn't asking for money or mercy. She was simply a mother watching her son fall apart. "I'm sorry," I whispered. And I meant it not for Vincent but for her. For the endless cycle of men in her life who had disappointed her. "I just wanted you to know," she said softly. "You don't owe him anything, but I wanted you to know." After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my living room, the glow of the fireplace flickering against the walls. And I realized something profound. Forgiveness is not about them. It's about us. About choosing to release the weight of anger, not because they deserve it, but because we deserve peace. I didn't forgive Vincent for his sake. I forgave him for mine. Quietly, silently, without telling him. And in that moment I felt the last chain break. From that day forward, his name no longer haunted me. His story no longer defined me. Because I had a new story now. A story of survival, of transformation, of reclaiming power. A story that turned glue and humiliation into a symbol not of cruelty, but of consequence. He had chosen betrayal. I had chosen revenge. But in the end, I had also chosen healing. And healing is the sweetest revenge of all. Winter settled in, and with it came the final act of a story I had thought was already finished. Vincent's name had faded from conversations in the neighborhood. People no longer whispered his scandal because there was nothing left to say. The man who once strutted proudly through life had become invisible, and invisibility is its own punishment when you've lived on attention like oxygen. I had nearly stopped thinking of him, nearly stopped listening for updates when the phone rang one evening. It was Doris again. Her voice cracked as she said, "Leah, it's over. Vincent's gone." My heart stilled. "Gone," I whispered. He drank too much," she said softly. "His liver failed. The doctor said there was nothing they could do. It was quick." For a long moment I sat there staring at the wall, unable to breathe. I had imagined so many endings for him. Loneliness, disgrace, obscurity. But death had not been one I wanted. Not really. I had wanted him to live with the consequences, to face them every morning in the mirror. Instead, life had taken its own turn. I thanked Doris for telling me, and when we hung up, I sat in the dark with tears sliding silently down my face. They weren't tears of love. They weren't even tears of loss. They were tears for wasted years, wasted potential, wasted trust. Tears for the fact that the man I had once loved with everything in me had ended this way, shrunken, humiliated, broken, and finally gone. That night, I walked into my backyard and looked up at the stars. The air was cold, sharp, almost painful against my skin. And I whispered into the night goodbye. Not to him, not exactly, but to the part of me that had once lived for him. To the version of me that had endured betrayal and humiliation in silence, to the years I could never get back. After his death, there was no great revelation, no secret fortune left behind, no shocking will or letter of regret. Just silence. Just the reminder that choices always write their own consequences, whether we see them in this life or not. And as I moved forward, I realized that my story was not about Vincent. It never had been. It was about me. It was about every woman who has ever been broken by betrayal and forced to rebuild from the rubble. It was about turning anger into action, humiliation, into healing scars, into strength. My counseling practice grew even more after his passing. Women looked at me not with pity, but with respect. They saw not a victim, but a survivor. They saw someone who had been to the bottom, who had stared betrayal in the face, and who had still risen not untouched, but unbroken. Sometimes after group sessions, I would sit in my office alone and reflect. I thought of the tube of glue of the ambulance, of the whispers that had once consumed me. And I realized that moment, shocking as it was, wasn't the real revenge. The real revenge was what came after: the life I built, the women I helped, the peace I carved out for myself. Because revenge without healing is just another chain. But revenge with healing becomes freedom. And freedom is what I carry with me now. So to the ones listening, if you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever been mocked, dismissed, or broken by the very person who swore to love you, hear me. Your worth is not determined by their lies. Your strength is not erased by their betrayal. You are more than the scars they left behind. You don't need to glue their mistakes to your heart anymore. You don't need to carry their shame. You get to choose. You get to build. You get to live. I am living proof that betrayal does not have the final word. You do. If my story spoke to you, if it reminded you of your own strength, I would love for you to like this video, share it with someone who might need the reminder, and subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. And please leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Tell me how you found your strength after betrayal. Because healing doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we speak together, when we lift each other from the shadows. Thank you for listening.